Okay, I didn't come up with a better way to introduce this one, so we're just gonna jump right into it. This one's called 100 Years Theory, which is not really much of a theory, it's more of a hypothesis, or rather, a postulate. I'm posing this as a question to myself. I will at this time ask everyone to keep your arms and legs inside the ride at all times because we will be going a little deep on this one, but for the rest, it's not as deep as it goes. So please just sit back and enjoy the ride. According to the 100 Years Theory, and the more I think about it, the more I want to say that it's between 100 and 150 years, but just for the sake of arguing, we're going to estimate it to be around about 100 years. 100 years from now, nobody's gonna know or even care about our thoughts, opinions, and or achievements. And you may not agree with this theory, but when compared to the sheer amount of things that actually did happen 100 years ago, the amount of things that we do know is probably less than 10% of the amount of things that actually did happen just about 100 years ago today. And that's if the information that we have is even accurate from just 100 years ago. To examine these ideas a little more closely, let's go over a few events from between about 100 years ago and present day. Starting with some current events, this is one I ain't even gonna report on this. We all saw it. This one's gonna go down in history and people gonna see it for what it is, or some people might not. But those are the ones that can call a spade when it's somebody that they don't like. But when it comes to somebody that they do like, they want to call it something else. You can call a cat a dog all you want to, but it's not going to make that mug play fetch with you. I bet you that. And no way, as a matter of fact, on second thought, I will be reporting on this because they all in our face blatantly did it right out in the open, unapologetically. So somebody gonna have to tell this shit like it's really T.I. is. I'm gonna let this play all the way through for you one time. Then I'm gonna come back and give you my synopsis or my take on what just happened here.
I want to say thank you for making it happen. Thank you. My heart goes out to you. It is thanks to you.
Now, that was blatant in our face. Like I said, the first time was like he dunked in our face. You could tell by the way he moaned. He meant that. Now, the second time, he turned and did it with the hint of respect or honor, even. So, whoever that was that he did it to back there is most likely his superior officers. But did you see he almost did it 3 times? Whoever it was that he was motioning to when he said, "My heart goes out to you," it would have been too obvious had he'd have done it that third time. So it looks like this thing was all staged. Now let's watch it one more time, and after hearing me say that, and you tell me what you think.
I want to say thank you for making it happen. Thank you. My heart goes out to you. It is thanks to you.
And so, I mean, come on, guys. We got to be brutally honest with each other about this. We got to be brutally honest to ourselves and to each other about these things. And to anybody pretending like we didn't see what we just saw, they suffering from either cognitive dissonance, willful ignorance, or flat out brainwashed, which means the line has already been drawn. They are on their side of the line and we are on our side of the line for a reason. So let's not keep playing about that. And because I couldn't find a better spot, I'm going to drop this right here.
Revolution about to be
He
televised.
said
The
it
right time,
best.
but the wrong guy.
And now, this is a topic that permeates throughout time, the revolution, and might very well pop up 100 years from now. People might still be talking about some sort of a revolution. So it's awfully strange that this is coming around now. To which, dare I say, power to the people, because the people have the power and they have the power of now, which is a superpower if used correctly. That's one that the oppressors of such power cannot anticipate, deflect, or deploy, even when they know what's coming. The power of now gives advantage over one who is immersed in their own reality. Meaning, somebody might think they're a tough guy, but there's some real tough guys out there, and they don't find out until it's too late. Let me tell you why I said ain't nothing wrong with white people. Well, mostly because when white people revolt, they revolt. And some things actually might get done around this place. And see, I've been forced into situations through life's lessons. I've come to realize the devil come in all colors. And when you experience enough about life, you'll learn racism is profitable like a business. It's beneficial to the ones that uses it properly in terms of finances and status. In a situation where racism is no longer offering a benefit to status or finances, it goes right out the window. When all the chips are down, there's a common goal and a common enemy. That racism bit goes right out the window. A couple quick scenarios some people can relate to, like being on the sports team with members of different races, being in the military, fighting in the war on the same side with members of different races, or maybe something like being homeless, all could cause racism to no longer be a benefit financially or to status. And a lot of times, those people will throw that racism right out the window. They'll get along just fine. So, to make a long story short, white people have the ability to choose to do right or wrong, just like everybody else. And therein lies our power. So, that to me is a better way to decipher if a person is racist or not, by what they do rather than what they say. Not by what they say, but by what they do. So, anyway, forgive me for being all preachy on my little soapbox, as they say. So, on to the next topic. To get back on topic, a 100 years from now, the flip side of that coin, 100 years ago, let's look at a few things that was going on around about 100 years ago. A look back at some events that happened about 100 years ago. And there's nothing special about this website. I'm non-affiliated. I just typed it into the search engine 100 years ago, and this one popped up. So I haven't fact-checked any of this stuff. I haven't cross-referenced anything, but this is a legitimate website. This is a real article, and it serves to prove a point. So let's take a look at what this article says, titled 100 Years Ago in Photos, a look back at 1924. Again, this is a random article dated March 5th, 1924 by Alan Taylor. You can look it up yourself. But it starts off by saying, a century ago, regular radio broadcasts were on the rise, and people began tuning in to entertainment and news from around the world. Paris hosted the 1924 Summer Olympics. Advancements in aviation were being made on several fronts. Automobiles were becoming more prevalent and dangerous, and prohibition in the U.S. was still in full swing. Students were using tablets made of slate, and computers were human beings that operated calculating machines. Below are a handful of images of some of the events and sites around the world in the year 1924. So let's have a look. This one says children listen to battery powered radio receiver that is set on a table in a swimming pool in Washington, D.C. in July of 1924. Somewhat interesting. On to the next. Men work high above ground painting the Eiffel Tower in Paris, France on July 29, 1924. It's a really nice view. Women assembled telephones in London factory in 1924 following the introduction of automatic telephone exchanges. Old school rotary right there. This one's pretty interesting. 2 cars at a time run through the auto wash bowl to clean the mud and dirt from the wheels and axles. This new method of washing automobiles is seen in Chicago, Illinois on September 20th, 1924. It's a pretty decent invention. I wonder why we don't have one of those nowadays. And this one says a contestant in midair during ski jump event in St. Moritz, Switzerland in January 1924. Really nice photography there. This one says original caption photo shows Duke Kahanamaku and others. Certain point winners for Uncle Sam in the swimming event at the 1924 Paris Olympics. Yeah, that's that famous swimmer from Hawaii right there, isn't it? The guy all the way on the left. A few of those other guys might be famous for swimming too. I don't know. And guys, to reiterate, I have not checked the validity of any of these photos. I haven't checked them for Photoshop, but I do notice they all have vanilla skies. So, whatever that means. This one says Raul Pescara's 16 bladed helicopter leaves the ground in France to attempt the world endurance record in January 1924. Pescara's flight set a new record, staying airborne for 8 minutes, 13.8 seconds. That's pretty interesting. 100 years ago, the longest helicopter flight, 8 minutes. Moving on. This one says from May 13th, 1924, original caption Teddy Roosevelt 3D at circus. 10-year-old Teddy was the grandson of former U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt. Couple things could be said about that image, but we'll move on. And this one's pretty interesting, but I just want to skim through. I don't want to read all of them. I mean, if you like this kind of stuff, then it's really interesting, but you can come back and have a look. I'm just going to go through a few more. A portrait of a young unidentified shoe shiner in City Hall Park, New York City on July 25th, 1924. So, as the theory goes, 100 years from now, no one's gonna know or even care who we are or what we did for the most part, unless we were able to do something very extraordinary or outstanding, or just got lucky and did or said something at the right time. Now, this one's quite peculiar. Just 100 years ago, didn't even have child labor laws. This kid was a shoe shiner in New York City. They knew the date, but they didn't know the poor lad's name. Look at there. Pretty sad, I'd say. He even looks pretty sad, strangely enough. Who knows? His story may be somewhere. This photographer didn't get it, obviously. That's a powerful picture. This one says original caption April 7th, 1924, Highland Park, Michigan, crankshaft grinding department in Ford plant at Highland Park. One of the first assembly lines, I'm assuming. This one I thought was interesting. Original caption Farmer Frank Zawistowski plows his 4-acre plot of farmland at the corner of 164th Street and Sherman Avenue with apartment buildings in the background in Bronx, New York City, New York. On the 4th of November, 1924, Zawistowski grows vegetables on the plot of land, as well as keeping chickens and cow in Bronx, New York. Who would have thought? Quite a lot of info on this guy, Farmer Frank. You know what goes on in farmers in their fields. A lot of times they use to cover up things. So let's keep it moving. This one's interesting. Calvin Coolidge, opening pitch, World Series. This one's really interesting. The USS Los Angeles ZR-3 flies over Washington, D.C., with the U.S. Capitol visible in the background in November 1924. That is amazing photography there. Look at that. Just 100 years ago, dirigibles in the sky over Washington. Wonder who's taking the picture. Women athletes jumping hurdles in Chicago. This one's slightly interesting. A view of New York's Two Bridges neighborhood with the Brooklyn Bridge at the right and the Manhattan Bridge at the left, circa 1924. This one, they're appearing in the Moulin Rouge Review. Look at this one. It says, original caption from December 17th, 1924. Picks him up at 25 miles an hour. If the modern auto or truck hits you, don't worry. Equipped with this device, you are simply given a free ride. This man even came from behind another car, was struck but not even scratched. The demonstration was given recently in Washington, D.C. That's outstanding. A bumper bench. Says the guy got hit by the car and didn't get a scratch. And the driver gave him a ride to his destination. How's that for a hot invention? Kill you either way, I'm sure. Blam! Anyway, there goes some hidden tech for you. U.S. government clerks use new calculating machines to determine the bonuses for World War I veterans following the passage of the 1924 World War Adjusted Compensation Act, or Bonus Act, compensating veterans for wages lost during their service. So these were actually the first computers. Look at this one. Benito Mussolini goes for a drive with his pet lion cub named Ras in 1924. 100 years ago. The whirl of the world, palladium. A London police officer holds up traffic in Parliament Street to allow members of Parliament to get to the House of Commons on a rainy winter evening, December 2nd, 1924. The next one. Warren Kealoha, Hawaiian Olympic swimmer. Chinese school children pose with their slate tablets in Peking. This photo shows the radio station at the Columbus Stadium, by means of which spectators were able to follow the progress of the Olympic marathon race. Scouts along the route reported to this station by telephone, and a series of amplifiers carried the information to thousands in the stands. First broadcasting systems. Pretty neat. Radio girls adorned with antenna appear in the review. I don't know if those are all girls or all guys. I don't know. 100 years ago. Interesting. Pretty interesting. Car loses a wheel at high speed, Culver Speedway, Los Angeles, California. Here goes another child laborer. Roland, an 11-year-old newspaper carrier seen in New Jersey in 1924. Well, at least they got this kid's name. He's got a big old smile on his face. He must have made some good money that day selling newspapers. Yep, this one. Huge telescope being installed in 1924. Offshore near Detroit, Michigan, this bootlegger is dumping his load of hooch over the side of his little launch as the federal boat nears in the pursuit. Prohibition was in effect in the United States from 1920 through 1933. Just think about that for a second. Less than 100 years ago, it was illegal to consume alcohol. Prohibition was in full swing. This one says drivers posed beside their Piggly Wiggly grocery trucks along C Street Northwest in Washington, D.C. around 1924. Grocery trucks in 1924? I mean, I would have never guessed they had grocery trucks 100 years ago. British mountaineers climb Mount Everest, found dead. And last but not least, visitors look toward an eruption of Hawaii's Kilauea volcano in 1924. So that was just a quick trip down memory lane, to kind of get us in the right time frame of events. Because now I want to go to a few specific events. And I want to point out a few, and then I'm going to wrap this thing up. And one of the first things I want to talk about before making my point, Purple Death, the Great Flu of 1918. So while going over some of our current events and thinking about the theory of 100 years from now, I started to feel like I was seeing a pattern from 100 years ago. So then I decided to actually go back and look at some of the things I might think I know something about from 100 years ago. And so that's what brought me to here. Of course, it reminds me of the pandemic we just recently had in our modern times. But what is it that we know about the Great Flu of 1918, just over 100 years ago? I mean, they made it seem to me as if people were dying all out in the streets, mass burial sites, people throwing bodies out of windows just to get rid of them. It is how they made it seem. And that's most likely what they'll think about us 100 years from now. Just people dying everywhere. But let's read a little bit about what it says actually happened. This is from the Pan American Health Organization and the World Health Organization website. It says, this article was written by Sarah Frances Fujimura for the Volume 8, Number 3 through 2003 issue of Perspectives in Health, the magazine of the Pan American Health Organization, published from 1996 to 2007. It says, U.S. at war. Mystery virus leaps around the globe, killing scores in its path. Scientists race to find a cure. Not headlines from March 2003, but from 85 years earlier. In 1918, hundreds of thousands of American troops headed to Europe for the closing offensives of World War I.
In that time, during the final months of World War I, more soldiers died of the flu than were killed on the battlefield during 4 years of fighting. As opposed to the coronavirus, the most vulnerable were in their 20s.
Meanwhile, back at home, schoolgirls jump rope to a new chant. I had a little bird, its name was Enza. I opened the window and influenza. I'm not going to read it all, so please feel free, if you're interested, help yourself with this information. It's quoting the book America's Forgotten Pandemic, The Influenza of 1918 by Alfred Crosby. See, I could look that up. But it goes on to say, despite its name, researchers believe the Spanish flu most likely originated in the United States. One of the first recorded cases was on March 11, 1918, which is awfully strange that our modern day pandemic started around March also at Fort Riley in Kansas. Overcrowding and unsanitary conditions created a fertile breeding ground for the virus. Within 1 week, 522 men had been admitted to the camp hospital suffering from the same severe influenza. Soon after, the Army reported similar outbreaks in Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, and California. Navy ships docked at the East Coast ports also reported outbreaks of severe influenza and pneumonia among their crews. The flu seemed to target military personnel and not civilians. So the virus was largely overshadowed by hotter current affairs such as prohibition, the suffragette movement, and bloody battles in Europe. By May 1918, influenza began to subside in the United States, but the ordeal was by no means over. Soldiers at Fort Riley, now ready for battle, incubated the virus during their long, cramped voyage to France. Once they hit French shores, the virus exploded, striking the Allied forces and Central Powers with equal force. The Americans fell ill with the 3-day fever or Purple Death. The French caught purulent bronchitis. The Italians suffered sand fly fever. German hospitals filled with victims of Blitzkatarrh or Flanders fever. No matter what they called it, the virus attacked everyone similarly. It started like any other influenza case with a sore throat, chills, and fever. Then came the deadly twist. The virus ravaged its victims' lungs, sometimes within hours. Patients succumbed to complete respiratory failure. Autopsies showed hard red lungs drenched in fluid. A microscopic look at diseased lung tissue revealed that the alveoli, the lungs' normal air filled sacs, were so full of fluid that the victims literally drowned. The slow suffocation began when patients presented with a unique symptom, mahogany spots over their cheekbones. Within hours, these patients turned a bluish black hue indicative of cyanosis or lack of oxygen. I'm gonna jump down. It says, what made this influenza especially baffling to healthcare workers was that it attacked healthy, strong adults most often. Normally, flu is only life threatening to the elderly, young children, and people with compromised immune system. Strangely enough, they told us something similar to that here recently.
It was called the Spanish flu, but that was only because Spain, which was not at war, allowed the press to report on it openly, unlike here. The first serious outbreak in the United States began at Camp Funston, now Fort Riley in Kansas. As infected soldiers from across the country made their way to the trenches in France, the virus spread. But the nation wasn't told. A year earlier, President Woodrow Wilson had rammed through Congress the Sedition Act, making it a crime to say or publish anything negative that would affect the war effort.
Wilson created what was called the Committee for Public Information. The architect of that committee said, "Truth and falsehood are arbitrary terms. The force of an idea lies in its inspirational value. It matters very little if it is true or false."
Was that a license to lie to the American public?
It was precisely that.
It says, many adults become sick, but very few die. Spanish flu turned the tables on this pattern. Disproportionate numbers of men and women, especially pregnant women, died, leaving their orphaned children behind. So that was pretty devastating. Skimming ahead, I'm going to jump down to where it says the second and third waves of the Spanish flu slammed the United States in the cold weather months of 1918. This time, civilians were not immune. The country's indigenous people, particularly Native Alaskans, suffered disproportionately. The flu completely wiped out some villages in Alaska, and others lost most of their adult population. Big city dwellers fared poorly too. New York buried 33,000 victims. Philadelphia lost nearly 13,000 people in a matter of weeks. Overwhelmed with bodies, many cities soon ran out of coffins, and some had to convert streetcars into hearses to keep up with demand.
With deadly consequences, no more so than in Philadelphia, which went ahead with a huge war bond parade in the fall of 1918, when the virus was at its most virulent. Newspapers killed stories, quoting the medical community saying, "Don't do it."
So 48 hours later, influenza exploded around the city. The result is it's one of the hardest hit cities in the world, and the mass graves being dug by steam shovels and so forth.
And how many people died?
About 14,500 in Philadelphia.
Says Crosby described how overburdened undertakers were. In some cases, the dead were left in their homes for days. Private undertaking houses were overwhelmed, and some were taking advantage of the situation by hiking prices as much as 600%. Complaints were made that cemetery officials were charging $15 burial fees and then making the bereaved dig the graves for the dead themselves. To avoid dragging it all the way out, I'm going to stop this right here and make a point. So they actually are still teaching it like I remember it from school. But how much of it could I consider to be absolute truth? And I only say that because I don't know how much of the modern day pandemic could I actually consider to be true. Not overly compelling, but at the very least notable. However, I do notice a pattern starting to emerge. So the next biggest event I wanted to look at from about 100 years ago is the Great Depression. So the next thing I came to, which fit the parameters of this theory, the Great Depression. And of course, I only came to this website to be on the same page as everybody else. This is another one that if you remember anything that you were taught about it or in school or heard about it, they're still writing about it the same way today. So I'm going to briefly go over a few things just to refamiliarize ourselves with a little bit about the Great Depression. It says, the Great Depression was a severe global economic downturn during 1929 to 1939. The period was characterized by high rates of unemployment, poverty, drastic reductions in liquidity, industrial production and trade, and widespread bank and business failures around the world. The economic contagion began in 1929 in the United States, the largest economy in the world, with the devastating Wall Street stock market crash of October 1929, often considered the beginning of the Depression. Among the countries with the most unemployed were the U.S., the United Kingdom, and Germany.
1929. The financial house of cards collapses, and the overinflated stock market plunges into a Great Depression. A financial panic grips the world. For the majority, it means the interminable line outside factory gates, desperately hoping for a job that rarely comes. It means hunger and a march of the unemployed in the nation's capital. With acute domestic problems, America would now isolate herself more than ever from the international scene. It started in America, but practically overnight an economic blizzard swept the world. In Japan, France, Britain, always the unemployed, the soup kitchens, the grinding poverty, and the despair.
Because from what I can remember, from what I was taught, it's like people were jumping out of buildings everywhere, soup lines a mile long, employment was through the roof. Seems like everybody lost everything. But let's see what it says. The Great Depression was preceded by a period of industrial growth and social development known as the Roaring Twenties. Much of the profit generated by the boom was invested in speculation, such as on the stock market, which resulted in growing wealth inequality. Banks were subject to minimal regulation under laissez-faire economic policies, resulting in loose lending and widespread debt. By 1929, declining spending had led to reductions in manufacturing output and rising unemployment. Share values continued to rise until the Wall Street crash, after which the slide continued for 3 years, accompanied by a loss of confidence in the financial system. By 1933, the unemployment rate in the United States had risen to 25%. About 1/3 of farmers had lost their land, and about half of its 25,000 banks had gone out of business. The U.S. federal government under President Herbert Hoover was willing to intervene heavily in the economy. In the 1932 presidential election, Hoover was defeated by Franklin D. Roosevelt, who from 1933 pursued a set of expansive New Deal programs in order to provide relief and create jobs. In Germany, which depended heavily on the U.S. loans, the crisis caused unemployment to rise to nearly 30% and fueled political extremism, paving the way for so-and-so's big party to rise to power in 1933.
Nor were Depression-era hardships limited to America, which helped to fuel the rise of extremist political movements in Europe, including Adolf Hitler's ascension to power in 1933 Germany.
I'ma just stop it there. Because let me draw your attention back to the word deflation, which is said to be one of the causes of the Great Depression. And you look into it a little bit more, words like deflation, inflation, recession, depression. It's my opinion that these words are synonymous with each other. Why? Because the common denominator is all the same. Devaluation of the dollar, i.e., the dollar has no value. However, one could argue, based on the literature that is written, I didn't write any of this stuff. One could argue the souls of men is the true value of this country. The souls of these young unemployed men that they're sending off to war once the dollar loses its value.
While most historians place the end of the Great Depression in 1939, the true economic turnaround occurred in 1941, after the U.S. entered World War II, following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, making the Great Depression one of the worst hard times in American history.
The souls of men is what holds the true value in this country, and is most likely the reason for this whole performance in the first place. So let's be on the lookout for that. So after looking back at that, I'm certain there's some sort of a pattern or playbook, for lack of a better word, that they must be referring to. So being as though I'm feeling like we reading out of the actual playbook right now, the next thing I wanted to look up, lastly but not least, the Tulsa race riot. And I don't even want to read anything about this here. I do want to highlight a few points. It happened in May of 1921. So that's around about 100 years. So it's in the playbook, if you ask me. And apparently, a lot of the things happen the way they said they happened. And some things may not have happened the way that we're being told. And some things may have been omitted altogether. Because, in my opinion, this wasn't the first or the last time that they ran a play like this. Looking through history, one might find evidence of this same play being ran multiple times in multiple different places until they finally got a good score in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is why some stories like this seem to persist and others are never heard about at all. So because this hasn't happened yet in our modern time, at least not overtly, I would argue that some of these stories are being told this way because they're foreshadowing, predictive programming, especially when you put it into context. Contrary to popular belief, people survived the Great Depression. People survived the Great Depression. Some were even thriving. Most of the rich people stayed rich until this day and went largely unaffected. And most of the poor people stayed poor until this day and largely went unaffected by the Great Depression. And once you actually take a moment to realize that, the whole thing looks altogether differently. So we need to be on the lookout for stuff like this, if not overtly, covertly. So I said all that to say, and to wrap this up quickly, and I know I left out a lot of things, and I might have to come back and expound on a few things a little more. Looking back, history teaches us there will come a time when we might have to put aside our prejudices and work together to bring about the greater good. So as much as y'all might not want to hear this, the immigrant problems that we have in where they mistreating people and forcing them out in the name of good, that's all of our problem. The prejudice, racism problem that we're having, where they mistreating, misrepresenting black people, that's all our problem. And the white people problem, where they're gaslighting and forcing them into perpetual servitude to the point where they'll be unaliving themselves over the stock market, that's all our problem. And it would be in our best interest to be proactive, work together to bring about a better solution. And that's all I'm gonna say on that. Over and out.